It's BSDCan time. Allan and I are both enjoying what is sure to be a super busy week, but don't think that we've forgotten about you. We have an interview with Beno Rice to help get you through till the next live episode. So stick around, the show's coming your way right now. BSD Now, episode 145, At the Core of It All, recorded June 8th, 2016. Hey, I'm your host, Chris Moore.
And I'm Allan Jude.
And we're glad to have you guys with us this week. So, if you've been a longtime watcher or viewer of the series, you probably know that sometimes it's a lie when I say what the date was when we recorded this because, you know, things happen and we have places to go and places to be and people to talk to, right? So this week, we're actually in Canada, and I know you've heard us talking about this in previous weeks. We're probably having a lot of fun, already very tired, but it's going to be an awesome week, and wish you were there. If you're watching this, maybe you did come and you're watching this later, or maybe you just couldn't make it this year, in which case, I'm sorry. Try and make it out next year. It'll be a lot of fun. But that doesn't mean we leave you hanging, right? We always try and have a little something for you every week, even when we're gone. So today's no exception. We're going to have an interview with Beno Rice, who's running for the core team for FreeBSD. So we're going to be talking about what that means and what that looks like here in the very near future. So stick around for that. And of course, when we get back from Canada, there's going to be a lot to talk about. I'm sure a lot's going to happen there, especially it's always fun that the year of a .0 release, because there's just so much stuff going on and last minute things to get in. So it's a good time. I always enjoy the .0 releases the most, just because that's when the community really seems to come alive and people get heated arguing about things like, no, we should do this or not do that. So good times. So definitely try and make it out next year. And me and Allan will be back pretty soon here, and we'll hopefully have a lot of good info to share with you about how that went. So, of course, before we go into the interview, we're going to have to mention a couple of sponsors this week. So we're going to start with DigitalOcean. Of course, the website for that is digitalocean.com, where you can go and get signed up and start spinning up your cloud open source servers out, somewhere in the cloud, wherever you'd like. Actually, they have them all over the place. So you can get a server hosted in London, in Toronto, San Francisco, New York, Singapore. Germany was one.
Yep. Frankfurt and Amsterdam.
Netherlands, Amsterdam, yep. And then, of course, there's one up in India they're getting ready to spin up, and everything's backed by SSDs, all the enterprise features you want, like being able to do team accounts so everyone can have their own password and log in. You can grant permissions and all that. So definitely a lot of good stuff. And the best thing is they support BSD. And not only that, they even have it in the drop-down, like install a free BSD system. 60 seconds later, you're up and running. You can SSH in, and you're good to go. And you can administrate it all through their wonderful HTML5 interface, which makes it super simple to spin things up. So if you don't want to use FreeBSD, of course, you can do OpenBSD, Dragonfly Net. There's instructions floating around the internet for that. So definitely Google it. I'm sure you can figure that out.
Because of the HTML5 console, you can start with a FreeBSD image and then use your console access to replace that with whatever BSD you want. They also have a great API, so you can do things in an automated fashion. They have great examples of how to do it. But if you don't want to go write your own API client, they have command line clients already available. So you can just get, docmd, create droplet, boom, and you can do it all without even having to go to a website. Which is very handy when you want to do a lot of VMs at once.
Yeah. Being able to work with them programmatically is really handy. So definitely check it out today. Of course, if you speak to anyone over there or email with anyone, let them know you heard about it here over on BSD Now, because we would appreciate that. And I'm sure they would love to hear about how you found them. But definitely good stuff. I know me and Allan both use them for different things, so you should be doing that too. Okay, so we're going to head over to our interview with Beno Rice here in just a moment. So stay tuned, and I hope you enjoy that.
And we're joined by Beno Rice, who's the manager of OS and networking at EMC Isilon. Welcome back to the show, Beno.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. This is the first of our series of interviews with the candidates for the FreeBSD core team, of which you were the first. So let's start with a quick recap of some of the past contributions you've made to FreeBSD.
I started using FreeBSD, 94, 95. I built a news server back when news actually was a thing. for the ISP I worked for at the time. I got my commit bit around 2000 for kicking off the PowerPC port. Bought myself one of those old colourful plastic shell iMacs and tried to get FreeBSD running on that. I also did some work on ARM. I did a bit of work on an ADSL driver that I don't know if that ever made it into the tree. These days I work for Isilon, and I've been working on... Whoa! Someone sent me a message and my phone vibrated itself over. There we go. Okay, I'll just hold it. All right. So recently I've been, last several years I've been working for Isilon. We've been working to update the version of FreeBSD that underlies our 1FS product. And I've been marshalling the resources that I have in order to try and do a bunch of improvements. So directly, not so much, but indirectly, I've been making sure that people like Brian Drury have been able to work on the build stuff. Conrad Meyer's been doing a bunch of stuff around PCI Express non-transparent bridging, and also just fixing a whole bunch of Gaverity defects. Mark Johnston's been doing a bunch of work in the VM with Alan Cox. And yeah, just trying to make FreeBSD a better place for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So have you had much interactions with the core teams of the past?
Bits and pieces. Obviously, I interacted very briefly with core when I got my commit bit, as we all did.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, as one of the people that hangs around on certain IRC channels, you tend to be able to chat with people a bit more, which is, you know, some people might say it's a good thing, some people might say that's a bad thing. But in general, I've known the people, a subset of the people on core. And I also chatted with them a bunch this year, about the Randy Harper incident.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking with a bunch of them about that because I was around for some of the OSCon stuff, and I've also, through being part of the Python community as well, I've seen a lot of just how community interaction stuff can work really well as long as you're thinking about it properly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that I want to try and bring into, if I get onto core, it's one of the things I want to try and do is make the FreeBSD community a more active, more robust, more welcoming thing.
That's hopefully what everybody wants.
Yeah. I think there is one of the problems with that kind of statement is there are a lot of ways to approach that. And I have a bunch that I think are right, and everyone else is going to have a bunch that they think are right, and it's really just a matter of trying to do the best by the project.
Yep. So that brings up the obvious question. Why did you decide to run for core?
So part of it was just the Randy incident and just watching the fallout from that and how it all played out. It was interesting. And it also highlighted in sort of tangentially a bunch of things that I've been worrying about in terms of the FreeBSD project for a fair old while, which is that we're not very good at bringing new people into the project.
Mm-hmm.
While internally we can be a fairly welcoming and supportive group, externally we are kind of cut off. And part of that's... I'll just go back a little bit. So then on top of that, I was at LinuxConf AU in Australia earlier this year. And while it's called LinuxConf AU, it's really more of a generalist open source conference. And one of the presentations was by a person called Emily Dunham, who works on the Rust project for Mozilla.
Mm-hmm.
And she ran through how Rust goes about making sure that they can attract new people, that new people get engaged, that they feel supported, how they feel welcome. And it was just this sort of revelatory thing of like, wow, that was just... I'll try and dig you up a link for the video of her talk to put in the show notes if you
want.
But it was just why can't we do these things? And so I actually asked the question, how would a project like FreeBSD retrofit these kind of things onto its engagement model? And obviously, thinking about why that was, and really it comes down to FreeBSD is a very old project.
Mm-hmm.
It was open source before open source was a thing, and that brings with it a bunch of sort of rusted on ideas that we've got about how things should work. And part of what I want to do is challenge a bunch of those.
Yeah, I think that'll be helpful. So you say that the project needs to develop a stronger community model. What are some of the ideas you have to achieve that?
Well, what I want to do is I think there are the beginnings of this within the FreeBSD project, and it's borrowing it from other open source projects, which is the idea that coding is not the only thing you can do to benefit the project. Glenn Barber, for example, does an amazing job at running a bunch of systems. That the project would not work without him doing all that kind of stuff, and he sinks a lot of his effort, his time, his energy into that. You've got people who do documentation. You've got people who do just support systems around FreeBSD. One of my bugbears is testing. If we could improve the testability and the automation of that testing for FreeBSD, that would be an enormous benefit. But it's not exactly a coding job,
right?
And I think if we could find someone to do that, even if if the foundation could fund someone to bootstrap it or something like that. And that would be a way that we could get people involved in FreeBSD that didn't necessarily involve coding. And the other one is also, I strongly believe, and this is going to be unpopular among certain people, I think we need the code of conduct, we need the code of conduct improved, we need the code of conduct enforced visibly, because if you're not treating everyone with respect, you're not helping the project.
Right.
And then after that, I think what we need to do is again, in this Rust presentation, everyone who contributes gets a shout out in a newsletter that they send out on a regular basis. So part of their regular newsletter is shout outs to first time contributors. One of FreeBSD's issues, I think, is that we don't have a strong model for people who don't contribute that aren't a committer.
Right. We have
one of the things you look at in modern open source projects is that the GitHub model, for lack of a better term, and I know you're going to ask me whether I think we should move to GitHub. The GitHub model actually encourages contributions from outside of your project sphere. And we need a way of doing that. It doesn't have to be GitHub. GitHub is just the most obvious, and it's the way that people are the most used to dealing with that kind of thing. But really, we need a way for people who aren't committers to contribute so that they may one day become committers.
Right.
And at the moment, there's no real obvious way to do that. Do they do it by a fabricator? Do they do it via PR? Do they do it via the mailing list? Do they hit up their friend on IRC? It's not obvious. And part of what I think we need to do in terms of just one of the obvious first steps to creating a better model for our community is just writing up the instructions and making sure that someone's there to catch the balls that people throw at us.
Yeah, because I think that's the bigger problem is that, the FreeBSD project tries to promote getting more contributions, but, if you go through Bugzilla, you find lots of perfectly good patches that have been sent in as a PR and have sat there for years, even though the way we recommend people send in those patches is via a PR.
Yeah, and each one of those represents a potential contributor that we've lost.
Yeah. The shoutouts idea I think is really good. We have the quarterly status reports, could easily have an item with just a giant list of names of people who've contributed something.
And publish it as a front page news item on freebsd.org.
Yeah, and we have there's actually a page with a list of contributors, but there's no criteria of what it takes to actually get listed there.
Yeah.
And
I mean, part of it is also that FreeBSD, because of like one of the ancient notions that we have that is possibly worth talking about is we firmly believe as a project that having the entire OS as a single code base in one big repository is the right thing. Is it worth having a talk about that? I don't really have an opinion one way or the other at the moment, but one thing I will say is that the size of our code base is very daunting. And so if you look at a lot of successful open source projects, I mean, even I don't know how many lines of code Linux is these days, but you look at things like Django or Python, like the line of code count that's in those things is not as big as what FreeBSD has, and also has a lot less concerns embedded in it than FreeBSD has.
Yep.
Like getting someone started on kernel coding is not an easy task unless they're really motivated.
Right. Yeah, and I think one of the other problems is that, again, back to the bug tracker, I've seen multiple times a developer runs into a bug and figures out what it was and fixes it, only after to find that there were PRs reporting it months or years before.
Yeah.
I know this happened to Brad Davis and I. We were looking at, I think it was some change that happened around FreeBSD 10.0 if you the Geli prompt that would come up during the mount route, if you typed in the password wrong the first time, the key in memory got zeroed out. So if you did type it correctly the second or third time, it wouldn't actually work. And because the first prompt was buried under D-message of like USB devices showing up late, you press enter because it was like hung, and that so you'd fail the first password because you just press enter, and then when you type it right the second time, it just wouldn't work.
And how many PRs were there on that?
There were 2 from like a year before, from like somebody who had run ahead and found it, and we didn't find those until after.
One of the non-coding contributions that people could make is just triaging this stuff.
Yep.
And also just making, get some people on a mailing list that gets mailed whenever someone puts a thing in Bugzilla so that we can actually get in there and make sure that everything gets sorted out.
Yeah, because oftentimes the other one is, somebody submits a PR and misses 1 or 2 critical bits of detail. But by the time someone actually looks at it and asks for that detail, the person's moved on. It's like been months. If we could reply to those PRs with the request for the extra information within a day or 2, or even just a couple of days, there's a much greater chance that they would actually provide the missing information and be able to move forward with it.
Yep.
So what do you think, what ideas do you have to actually attract new contributors once we've maybe made the process a little easier?
Well, that's an interesting one. I mean, I think there's another thing is that, people have moved, the open source sphere has moved on a bit from operating systems in a way. Which is a shame because it's. But then things can happen. I mean, everyone had kind of settled on MySQL as the database for the longest time, but then Heroku shows up and starts using Postgres, and everyone starts looking at Postgres again and going, "Hang on, this is actually really good." And couple that with Sun buying MySQL and then Oracle buying Sun, and then Oracle having this other database they'd rather you used, and so on and so forth. Suddenly, Postgres was something that people could jump to. No, I honestly don't think that that's likely to happen with Linux, much that it would be fun. But I think there's definitely a space for another operating system there just to keep Linux honest in a way. And I think there are a bunch of things that we could do that would make it more interesting. And I know from Twitter that you're a big fan of Docker, and I think containerization would be an interesting thing to pursue on FreeBSD because we have most of the bits.
Well, the Docker client works.
Resource constraint.
Well, actually, we have most of that now. So the official Docker client works on FreeBSD using real jails, and with RCTL, we have CPU limiting, although it's not as fine-grained as it could be. We have memory limiting, and we have... now, recently, Edward Naparala did the disk I/O limiting.
Yeah. And we have ZFS.
Yes. The only thing we're missing is an overlay file system. Something Docker relies on is being able to separate the base image from your changes. And
so Mark Johnson keeps threatening to try and work out why UnionFS is broken. That
sounds like a good idea.
Try and take him up on that.
Yes, I think that would be a good thing.
In his copious free time when he's not fixing the VM with Allan.
Exactly. So, and that's, again, where having more contributors can help because, in a lot of the areas, we only have, a very small number of domain experts, and we really need to build those up. And, becoming an expert in the VM system takes quite a few years of working with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we need to find those people soon.
People like Mark don't grow on trees.
Exactly.
The people that I can think of that I trust in the VM subsystem are generally all the people who work in there now, and they're there because whenever they start talking about the VM, I start going, okay, you said a bunch of words, and I know that they mean something, and given an hour or so, I could probably piece together a picture of what you're doing, but you seem to be able to rattle that off in 5 minutes. I understand bits of the VM. I don't hope, I could not claim to understand it to the extent that Jeff Robertson or Mark or Kib or anyone else does.
Yep. So the other interesting question was, where do we actually attract those new contributors from?
Well, that's the thing. I think really you need to start getting out there. I mean, it would be nice to have, say, core team members showing up at places like OSCON or something like that and actually talking about the things that we do with FreeBSD. I mean, it doesn't even have to be core. It would be good if the foundation could try and make sure that we're getting a couple of FreeBSD talks up at a couple of FreeBSD talks up at places like OSCON, the various OSCONs, it's OS Bridge, whatever else is out there. Get out there and start saying FreeBSD is an interesting project that you could be using for these things, and here is the ways that it does get used. Because I mean, at the moment, FreeBSD's strongest user base is appliances like Isilon's nodes, like NetApp, like Juniper, and that kind of thing. But there's a trend there for a lot of these new companies who are coming into that space to be using Linux. And how do we convince them that our thing might be better?
Yeah, but they have to have heard of it, and they have to provide a bigger talent pool that they can have access to.
And half the time, you have to have the talent pool at the level that's going to get roped in at the ground floor of these startups that are making these appliances, and that means that we have to be out there in a much bigger strength than we are at the moment.
Yeah, and the other obvious place is what Kirk McCusick calls the feedstock, which is the users that are already using FreeBSD, and how to turn more of them into contributors. And I think a lot of that just has to do...
They're just going to be dwindling faster because everyone just fires up a Ubuntu image these days.
Yeah, but I think the other thing is we have to not discourage them. Oftentimes, they make they post a patch or a contribution to stuff, but it doesn't get feedback, or the feedback it gets is not very positive.
Yep.
And
what we need is a reason for them to ignore their friend who just said just install Ubuntu.
Right.
Get them a PCBSD or something like that. I mean, I will admit that I use a Mac, and thus I am not a desktop FreeBSD user. But I think Adrian, Chad, and people like him have a point that if we can get people using it on their desktops, then that's a gateway to them using it on other things. Personally, I would say more, let's give them a reason to use it in their EC squared image or their Rackspace cloud server image or whatever. But I'm not going to stand in Adrian's way. In fact, I'm going to encourage him like hell. I'm just, it's not my use case.
Right. So the other thing you said is that you believe that getting more people into the project involves taking a hard look at how people actually contribute to the project and how much friction there is there, and how we can reduce that as much as possible to get contributions from somebody outside and eventually turn them into a contributor. Outside of, is that just a way of you saying we should switch to GitHub? What other ideas do you have there?
Well, okay. As I said earlier, GitHub is, the position that GitHub holds in the open source community is really that SourceForge held a while back, which is, it's the obvious way to get your project hosted and up and happening. But the thing is that GitHub did that with a user experience that's far better than SourceForge ever was. Yes. SourceForge was really just a pointy-clicky way of setting up a CVS repository or later a Subversion repository or whatever. It had a bit of an issue tracker and a bit of another thing, but GitHub did that a lot better than SourceForge did, and it looks like they've actually got it into a way that's more sort of sustainable from a business perspective than SourceForge was. So if you are looking for the lowest friction way possible to attract a bunch of open source developers to your project, being on GitHub is actually kind of important. That said, GitHub is very much an all or nothing proposition. And so we're kind of half on GitHub now in that we have our repository mirrored there, but all of the issues and stuff that get raised on there, I don't know what the path for those to get back into FreeBSD proper is in a way that actually makes sense. Right
now, it's every once in a while somebody might go look and be like, oh, yes, I'll try to integrate that.
Yeah.
Or
now, there are integrations we could do. We could set up webhooks so that there's something that whenever someone raises a GitHub issue, it raises an issue in Bugzilla. If they open a PR, then it goes into Fabricator.
So somebody had actually started one to extract the patch out of GitHub and put it into Bugzilla, but they ran into something and lost steam.
Yeah, and I think we either need to be all the way on GitHub or not at all. Because being the way we are there now just creates confusion and people raising patches that, again, just languish, and that's a contributor that we've hawked off and they're not going to come back.
Right, because we only get one chance to have that first interaction with them, and if it's bad, then...
Yeah, and so if we exclude GitHub as an option, then we kind of need to have something that works the same way. And I think that means... we need better integration between our issue tracking and Fabricator. We need a more obvious path for people to submit these patches that actually works and gets the patch accepted.
Yep.
And that just means a whole bunch of people reviewing patches, testing them, getting them on there, a better scheme to make sure that these patches end up with people who can actually test them, all those kind of things.
Yep. And, if we could automate some
really
of that too.
Right? It's not that I think we should move to GitHub. I think that moving to GitHub would be a solution. I don't necessarily think it is the solution. Mm-hmm. But I think it's something that we need to sit down and go, right, if not GitHub, then what?
Right. Well, that should be a good conversation to have at BSDCan, maybe.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that it will be had in several places. The real trick is making sure it actually translates into actual movement.
Yes, there's that. So getting back to the core team for a couple minutes, what strengths do you think you would bring to the core team?
I've been around the project for a long time, so I kind of understand a lot of the internal, politics and all that sort of the nature of the project. But I've also been around a bunch of other environments, like the Python community, like a bunch of other groups, and I think that I can bring in some ideas about how we can make the community work better so that the project actually has a longer-term future than it might have otherwise. Because what worries me is that we turn into this bunch of, older people who all talk about how Linux is crap and we should never use it, and then we all go off and do other things, and FreeBSD just sort of dwindles.
Right. Yeah. So do you think there's any critical things that the project has to do to survive and avoid that fate?
We need to work out how to get more contributors, and we need to really think hard about our non-committer contribution model. Mm-hmm. Because at the moment I think it's largely broken for a bunch of reasons. If you don't know a committer, it's really hard to get a patch into FreeBSD, and I think that's broken.
Yeah, it definitely shouldn't
needs
be that
to
way.
be fixed.
I think we should almost have a metric of what percentage of code going into FreeBSD came from someone who isn't a committer, and actually have a goal to have that be at least such a percentage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think there's any other things that the project could do to improve that aren't necessarily required to survive, but would make things a lot better?
I think we should have a bit of a think about how our build system functions and our policy of only building with what we have in the tree. I think that made a lot of sense a while back, but these days with the ports infrastructure being what it is, I think requiring people to do like a package install or package add. This is where I demonstrate that I have not used this tool in recently enough.
Package install.
Package install, build tools or whatever before they start doing build work on the system as a whole. I don't think that's a ridiculous thing to do, and it would allow us to use things like scripting languages like Python or Ruby or whatever that we felt like, or have external things that aren't part of the tree, what we actually ship, that we use to build what we ship. And I don't think that's actually a bad idea.
Yeah, I know.
And the other one is I think we should seriously have a think about what the structure of things is, and I think that's going on. You look at the packaging of base. I think there's at least two different approaches to that going on at the moment. That's a good start because that starts to let you think about the groups of things that we install and what their importance is. Because I think another thing that we could do in order to make ourselves more attractive to the next generation of appliance developers is really have a think about the board support package concept. Like, if you want a Raspberry Pi, here is the Raspberry Pi image you install. We have that, but what if I want to build an appliance built on top of a Raspberry Pi? Can I just download a source tree and type make Raspberry Pi and have it spit out that build image,
right,
complete with an installable file system? Because then I can go in and make tweaks. I could add ports. I could do whatever. Type make Raspberry Pi again, and off it goes.
Right. Yeah. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. Well,
you should vote for me for core.
Yes, already did. So, well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for having me.
Okay, back from the interview, folks. Hope you enjoyed that. And we'll look forward to hearing more about Benno down the road, and wish him luck with the core team election, too. Okay, so next up, our sponsor this week is going to be IX Systems, and the website for that, of course, ixsystems.com/BSD Now, where you can go and get in touch with those sales engineers. They can build the next greatest system, anything small, anything big, of course, all running the latest and greatest Intel processors. So they can do all kinds of fancy stuff. But not only that, we have something special to show you this week where they built a little bit different system.
Yes.
And Alan's got a bunch of pictures to show you of this system coming down the line. But what makes this system unique is it's actually one of the new Cavium Thunder X ARM boxes, a 48-core system of 2.5 gigahertz per core.
That's pretty beefy.
So that is pretty beefy. So you have to narrate some of the photos from
so here's
I can't
the back of it, and you can see you got your dual power supplies and then some USB 3 ports and your serial and VGA. And then it's got a 40 gigabit QSFP Plus connector, so you can get your 40 gigabit networking on. And then two 10 gigabit SFP Plus connectors. So you got your optics for dual 10 gigabit. Then the IPMI, regular copper Ethernet. And then over here, an Intel i350 with for dual 1 gigabit networking as well. So you got the whole range of different network connectivity built into this thing. It's got 128 gigs of RAM. And then if we go back to the... looking at the front of it, you can see it's got your 4 hot swap 3.5-inch bays and more USB ports and lights and so on the front. So they got 4 2-terabyte hard drives built into it. Got some nice close-ups here, and then you can see inside where you see there's the 128 gigs of RAM under that shroud to keep the airflow going across it. But 48 cores in a single CPU.
That's the single socket. Like I think they make a dual socket version of the board too, which would be 96.
Yes.
That would be nice. I would love to have a couple package builders like that for sure.
Yeah, it will definitely change building packages for ARM.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
That's some good stuff though. So it looks like this particular system has 4 2-terabyte hard drives because really they're not looking at storage so much as I think this one's going to the FreeBSD Foundation to mess about with.
Yes.
I'm sure they'll be doing some stuff, getting better BSD support for these new processors.
Yeah, although FreeBSD is pretty mature on this board, this particular machine, because Cavium has provided the people working on it with pre-production hardware, but this is the full production hardware. So that means that other people will be able to buy it now too. And it's nice to see the first one of these rolling off the assembly line going to the FreeBSD Foundation to keep working on that.
Yeah, definitely some good stuff. So check it out. Of course, if IX can build these kind of crazy systems, they can do just about anything you can throw at them. So give them a call, send them an email, get in touch with the sales guys over there. And of course, tell them what you want to do first so they can help design the right solution for you as opposed to just, here's something off the shelf. Like let them actually put something together that'll fit your specific needs. If you needed to do a particular type of load and a certain minimum number of IOPS, guaranteed, then let them design for that. And they'll make that happen.
Definitely, make sure you get the right Intel processor from the huge range of options there. And make sure you get the right kind of storage controller, the right disks, the right amount of SSDs, the right kind of SSDs, all that stuff.
That's right. So anyway, check them out. Of course, tell them you heard about it here on BSD Now because they love to hear from our listeners. Okay, so we're going to move into Beastie Bits for the week. So first up, we have our buddy Ted Uengst has a new blog post about file being considered harmful. Yes. Uh-oh, don't scare me like that, Ted. What's going on?
So the file command where you can do file and some file and it'll tell you what type it is. But some people depend on that a little too heavily. There was an interesting one we actually covered on my Sysadmin podcast the other day, which resulted in this interesting bug where OpenOffice couldn't print on Tuesdays. So basically, after it made the PostScript file, it would run in the file command. When you pass it off to, I think it was cups or something, it would run the file command on it. And it turned out if you had the word Tuesday in the creation line at a certain point in the file, then the file command would detect it instead of as a PostScript document conforming to level 3 that you could print, it would detect it as an Erlang jam file, version 4.2. Because of the TUE string and the one particular byte offset, which resulted in it not printing. By just adding the letter X in front of the day of the week, it stops that from ever happening. But it turns out that, yes, while the file command does a lot of stuff, they may be a little too eager to accept random people's regular expressions or byte sequence checks. It's a little too hacky, and so it can be quite inaccurate. So there's another example here where you can't print if you have certain inappropriate phrases in the file. So if your PostScript file contained a certain string somewhere in it, I forget what it says here, but it would detect it as a PGM image file, whereas the other one would detect it as something else.
Man, that's not good.
Yeah, so if you put the right string in it, then it would all of a sudden think it was an image instead of a text file. And a bunch of things like that. And so...
Well, I think the ending of the post he had here was really good. He said, a program that helps users is useful. A program that restricts users is harmful. Run file on your computer all you want, but don't use file to limit what I can do.
Yes, so I guess his problem here was when you ran file, so the desktop environment he was using, I think it was GNOME? I forget which one. Yes, GNOME. When you double-click on the link for Firefox, it ran the file command on the resulting file to figure what to open it with. But because Firefox was ASLR enabled, that returns a different signature from the file command than regular executable does. Oh. And so it would be like, I don't know how to open that type of file. But it's a binary. You should just run it, not try to open it in a web browser or something, right? And so it ended up meaning he couldn't launch Firefox in GNOME because it would run file on it and get confused. And so you have to make a script that then starts Firefox. And when we run file on the script, it's like, oh, that's a shell script. I know how to open that.
Right.
But yeah, you can definitely, it could use a little help there. And you got to be careful just depending on that.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, good stuff. Good stuff. So next up, we have an open source talk on ZFS. Yes. The intro to ZFS is actually a set of open source slides for the community to build on and reuse. And you can pretty much go and give this talk anywhere, at your local conference, your local bug, or if you have a Linux group and you want to go educate people on how ZFS works, this is a good place to start. And we have the link here. It looks like a GitHub site with all the details. There's a nice table of contents on what's covered there, how to compile the slides. So it looks like it uses LaTeX or TextLive. Does some stuff with Inkscape and Make, and you basically just run Make, and then you get a talk.pdf all ready to go. And of course, let's see, what license is it under? Creative Commons 4.0. So good stuff. And if you'd like to contribute to that, please send pull requests and do so. But this one, hopefully we see more stuff like this, because these are great ways to get information out there in the community. Not everyone has to start from scratch.
Yeah, every time I make my own intro to ZFS slides, I always forget to include some important feature. So, compiling these and so I'd like to see more of this as well. If you write up a good set of slides for your user group or a local conference, throw them up on GitHub under a nice license like this so that somebody else can give a similar talk somewhere where you're not going to be able to make it. Because,
That's right.
Yes, every conference should have an intro to ZFS talk so that we spread the word and get more people using ZFS.
Cool. Okay, so next up, ARM v7 now has a bootloader, it looks like, for OpenBSD here. So there's now a ARM v7 bootloader thanks to Katenis. Let's see, ARM v7 snapshots will configure disk to use EFI boot and then install the device tree files on a FAT partition at the start of the disk. So it looks like they added some support for EFI payloads in U-Boot 2016-05. And looks pretty typical. Install a bootarm.efi file, which can be placed on a FAT or ext2 partition as a EFI boot, bootarm.efi. And then the device table files are in slash or DTB or DTB/current. And then U-Boot will automatically load them. So some good stuff here. It looks like we'll see some more OpenBSD running on some of these new classes of devices.
Yeah. Interesting approach to dealing with EFI on ARM as well.
That's right. So what's up with these speed improvements here on SHA?
So when Colin Percival re-implemented the SHA-256 and SHA-512 algorithms on FreeBSD back in 2007 or so, he tuned them and tweaked them, got them to be faster than the old implementation, which was back from when SHA-2 first was introduced. And he had worked on it a bit, but basically couldn't get any more speed out of it back then. But since then, processors have advanced. In particular, they have they bias more towards a preference for memory loading instructions over large code footprints. And so basically, with the new set of code he did, a couple of small patches that just kind of rearranged the way the code works, he actually managed to get some speed improvements. So now if you look on... Then I did tests across at Scale Engine. We have quite a variety of hardware covering everything from like Core 2 Duos and like E5400 type Xeons all the way up to the latest Skylake stuff. And I benchmarked it across all of them, and he found that on your 2007 to 2008 processors, there's basically no performance change versus the old code because they were, that was as optimized as it was going to be for that. I think actually on the Core 2 Duos, there was like a 1% slowdown on SHA-512, but a slight speed up on SHA-256. Now, once you get to 2009, 2010 processors, you get about 10% increase in performance. For 2011 to 2012 processors, it's about 15%. And for the 2013 to 2015 processors, so like your Broadwells and your Skylakes, you get 20 to 25% more throughput. Interestingly, actually, even the Raspberry Pi 2 that I tested in got about 6 to 8% more performance.
Interesting. Okay. That's some good stuff there.
So that will give us that much more SHA-256 and SHA-512 performance, which is important because, FreeBSD Update uses that, obviously, but, Tarsnap uses that, and since this commit was sponsored by Tarsnap.
Sure. Okay, well, good stuff. Well, next up, we have Package Source has their 50th release. They did an interview with Jorge Sonnenberg. So looks like we have this link here. You want to read a little bit about this first, Alex? I will get the next one. I'm going to read the whole one.
So this is, they have their 50th release, and they did an interview, actually, with Jorg. And he's asked to introduce himself and explains that he's a software developer with a background in mathematics, and he's been doing open source development primarily for fun, although his interest has changed over time, and he's kind of moved around to different things. When asked about Package Source's 50th anniversary, or 50th release anyway, he says, Package Source quarterly branches were one of the reasons for me to start looking at Package Source in the first place, a bit more than a decade ago. As such, my 40th branch has passed recently, as well as a bit, which was a personal milestone for him. He's looking back proudly at what we have achieved, but also a bit sad at some of the faces and names that have disappeared over the time, which tends to happen with open source. And
Sure.
He says one of the main benefits to the Package Source system is it provides the freedom to have a consistent environment across multiple platforms. If you're in a position where you're using, say, BSD and Linux, having one package repo that works for both is really a handy thing to have. Especially if you're actually using 4 or 5 different operating systems. If you're going to have 2 or 3 flavors of Linux and then a BSD and a Solaris, being able to have one consistent set of packages across all of that is really a big win.
Sure.
When asked about how and when they use Package Source, they're talking about using NetBSD and SmartOS. And he says, what are the projects that he's currently working on for Package Source? Is bug hunting the Clang builds and returning to working on pbulk again. I'm not sure what that is. But he's also looking at reducing the required coupling of the masters and slaves for their builders, and sharing dist files is more challenging, and they're looking at NFS or null mounts. I'm glad FreeBSD was able to solve that problem in Poudre by using the jails instead of, and found that, spreading it out across servers didn't actually help as much as it spent a lot of time and code trying to coordinate between the masters and slaves when one really big master can just do it all.
Sure.
And they're also looking at doing NetBSD 7 bulk builds in a low memory virtual machine to make sure that they can still do that as well. And quite a few other interview questions. It's worth checking out. But also a reminder that there's Package Source Con 2016 will be in Krakow, Poland, July 1st through 3rd. This developer is planning
that
to be
was
there.
A fun trip.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Okay, so next up is kind of a funny one here we have this week. Somebody posted over one of the Dragonfly mailing lists And the initial post was, hey, currently I'm running PCBSD on a Sony Vaio laptop with GNOME, and it runs quite well. I'm wondering about reinstalling Dragonfly on it instead. Can anyone tell me if I'm going to get a better performance increase, in other words, a better kernel and faster file system with Hammer versus ZFS? I need to have lots of incentive to make a move. So somebody else replied, Justin
Sherrill,
replied,
yes, who we've interviewed in the past.
He said, it'll be fast, really fast, super fast. The kernel will have so many megaflops that the chassis of the laptop will actually start to vibrate and rise above the surface of your desk, quietly humming. It'll hover there, causing pins and small children to rattle in the vicinity until you reach out with a wondering hand and try to open the DVD-ROM because you left your favorite Chet Faker CD in there and you don't want anything bad to happen to it, and boom. The mere act of brushing up against it will upset the careful equilibrium set by Hammer's rebalancing mechanisms, and the raw power unleashed will cause your laptop to shoot off through the wall of your home, through the nice fence your neighbor put up last year, and right through some branches that odd tree always takes forever to pop out leaves on each spring, making you suspect that it might not be that healthy, but it's not on your property, so you can't do much about it. Your laptop shooting through space now leaves a sort of green trail after image that persists for several minutes and happens to match the green in Dragonfly's logo color exactly. I realize this is a nonsense answer and hope that you do too. However, there's no way to tell from what you wrote what model computer you have, what speed it's running at now, what you actually do with the computer, or if you can configure Xorg and a number of the other programs yourself, since PCBSD does that for you and Dragonfly does not. Don't take the above items as questions that I want you to answer so that I can evaluate your future computer use for you. Download a Dragonfly image and start it up. It's live. Try it out, although it'll be somewhat limited. So I thought that was an excellent response.
Some good writing there.
Definitely very
Remind me of Warren Block's intro to the latest status report.
That's right. All right, so Allan, you got to tell us about the last one here about if config has gotten an update.
So I remember talking to Sean Chittenden the first time at MeetBSD 2014. And he and somebody else were talking, and he was complaining about ifconfig. So he was teaching a bunch of Linux administrators how to use BSD, and they were all very confused when they ran ifconfig, and the subnet mask is printed in hexadecimal.
Okay.
I always why is that way? I
don't know. It's just always been that way. I've just come to accept it.
It's a little weird. And so I did a recent commit that adds the -f flag to ifconfig and allows you to specify different formats. So if you do -f inet : dotted, it will output the subnet mask in dotted quad format. So you get 255.255. whatever. Or -f inet : cider, and you will get cider notation. So you get, 10.1.1.7/24. You can also output the Ethernet address in with dashes instead of colons if you want to compare it to Windows machines or whatever. A couple things like that. And you can output IP addresses as host names or fully qualified domain names and a couple other things like that.
Nice.
Mostly just to kind of to build a framework that can be used to change the formatting in there. Although I'm looking at maybe making it do a couple other interesting things as well. But the big thing is that you can also control it with an environment variable. So if you set ifconfig_format to that string that you would normally pass to -f, then ifconfig will detect that and work that way so that you can set that in your shell script profile thing, and then ifconfig will always output in that format for you, and you won't have to remember to pass the flags.
Okay.
Yes. So I'm looking at maybe putting that in the default shell profile, but I don't want to break other people's scripts. Although I don't think anybody's script depends on hexadecimal and the subnet mask.
Yeah, I don't think any of ours do. I mean, we've had to parse some ifconfig stuff before, but not the hex.
Yeah. Well, the interesting one is the installer on FreeBSD parses it, but it will be perfectly fine if it comes back as a subnet mask instead.
Okay.
And it will actually look cleaner if you do. Basically, if you have to go through it a second time, when it pulls it back out, it lost the subnet mask you gave it and has it as a hexadecimal, and then it puts that in the dialog box, and you're like, "What the hell is that?" It's like, "Oh, that's the subnet mask I typed," but okay.
Yeah, whatever.
But yes, quite a few people were interested in that, and I managed to get that committed.
Well, cool. Thanks for throwing that in. Okay, so we're going to hop over to feedback and questions here in just a moment. But really quick, before we do, the last sponsor this week is going to be Tarsnap. Of course, the website for that, tarsnap.com/BSD Now. If you're not doing Tarsnap backups, you're not doing backups. It's pretty much the way it should be here, folks. Come on. Tarsnap makes it super simple. It's easy. Clients are small. They're easy. If you already know how to use the tar command, like a lot of us have used that for years, you're 90% of the way there, right? The command line usage is very similar, hence the word tar and the Tarsnap there. But of course, because backups are fully encrypted, everything's encrypted on your system before it goes out over the wire. You don't have to worry about anybody stealing your data. If you destroy your key, your data is as good as gone, regardless of how many copies of it may still linger in the cloud somewhere. Nobody's going to get that data or decrypt it without your key.
Yeah, when Colin designed it, he knew that, he has no idea what Amazon does with the data he puts up there in order to guarantee they won't lose it. They probably make all kinds of backups. And so when you delete it, they don't necessarily destroy those backups. And so you don't want your files just laying out there. And so by encrypting them on your machine before they go out there, it means that your key is never out in the cloud. And if you destroy your key, the files out in your cloud can never be decrypted and nobody can view them.
So definitely good stuff. Tarsnap makes it easy. Of course, the source is all open, so you can verify it on your own, make sure it's doing exactly what it's supposed to, and clients for just about everything under the sun. So don't delay. Start doing your backups the right way today. Do it with Tarsnap. Okay, so we got feedback and questions to get to here, Allan. So I guess I'll read the first one here from Eli. I know you answered this one in email, but this is a good one just to make sure others aren't confused too. But he says, hi, Chris and Allan. I ran across a posting on a FreeBSD subreddit, and he has the link, where someone claimed they were planning on getting rid of the ports entirely and that everyone should use packages. Is this something the core team is planning? This is one of the great features of FreeBSD when the default software for packages will not work for you. And I feel this is one of the best features, and he gives us the posting. I'd like confirmation if this is in the works and if there's a replacement, or we'll just have to track the project ourselves. Thanks, Eli. So no, ports isn't going away. Yes, we encourage more people to not use them and use packages whenever possible.
And if the default options don't work for you and you think doesn't work for many people, then we would like to change those and fix that instead. But all of those packages are built from ports. So if ports went away, so would all the packages.
We kind of need it. It's always going to be there at least as the build framework for packages at the bare minimum, but there's no reason why you still can't use them on your own, or use it to farm out and run your own Poudre instance to build packages, whatever, in exactly the configuration you want. But nope, not going away anytime soon.
Yep. So no worries there.
Yep. Okay, so next up is Morgan, who has a question about the best way to administrate jails. I've been playing around with Linux. I'll do this one, let you do the next couple, Allan. Sorry. Should have said that. But I've been playing around with Linux over the past years, and your podcast prompted me to give FreeBSD a try. Right now, I just have FreeBSD in a VM to learn a few things, but I'm hoping to do more with it in the future. I have a question/topic I'm hoping you can answer or even talk about on your show. Well, hey, here we are. We're doing it. He said, what's the best way to manage jails? In my Googling, I've come across EasyJail, Warden, IOCage, and I guess what could be called the hard way. What is the difference between these different options, and what would you want to use over the other? So far, I've only played around with EasyJail. I like the idea of base jail and flavors. Do other options have something similar? Thanks for the podcast and hopefully answering my question. So it is kind of up to personal preference. So Warden, we've stopped development of it here in favor of IOCage, which does a lot of the same stuff Warden did, plus adds some features of EasyJail, like the base jails and whatnot. So between the two, I would say you probably get EasyJail and IOCage, right? EasyJail is going to be, if you're on UFS, you kind of have to use EasyJail. You're not going to use IOCage there, because IOCage depends on ZFS to do a lot of the neat things it does with creating data sets and putting jails on a specific data set and cloning things, etc. So if you're using ZFS, I'd say just go ahead and try it on IOCage, unless you really like the EasyJail syntax.
Yeah, I'm very used to EasyJail, and it has good support for ZFS, although it doesn't depend on it.
Sure.
Although nowadays that space isn't really a premium, I find myself needing the concept of the base jail less. Although when I upgrade the operating system and I do it once and it upgrades 10 jails, I find that very useful. But at the same time, every once in a while, I'd like to run jails that were maybe not all the same version. As long as your host machine is new enough, you can run older jails as much as you want.
Yeah. You can run current and then run 10.3, run 10.2, 10.1, whatever.
And so, I'm kind of torn in between the different things. I haven't actually tried IOCage yet. I should give that a try, but EasyJail works very well. And I've done a little bit of stuff where doing it the manual way, which has gotten better with the new commit file syntax, although there are some changes I'd like to make there as well. Sadly, that didn't happen in time for 11.
Yeah. So I don't think you're necessarily messing out on anything because all those utilities still you can go through and tweak things by hand. So like the hard way, right? You can still go change settings and whatnot. The other day I had to set some different jail flags in Easy Jail. It's like, oh, just go edit the file. Here's all the flags.
There's just a params line there and you just stick in a bunch of stuff and it's good to go.
So I guess whichever you like and works best for you. If you're doing UFS, of course, IO Cage is out. So you'll have to use Easy Jail in that case. But if you on ZFS,
the other big one is
take your pick.
CBSD or something, right?
Yeah, I've not used that either. About that.
So. Since Warden's kind of out, that gives us back to having 3 options.
Right.
But yeah, I use EasyJail. Chris uses IO Cage. We're both happy.
Oh, you want to grab the next one from Simon?
So Simon says, hey guys, is it possible to tell Poudre to skip building packages that are already available with PKG from the default FreeBSD repo so he can speed up his build? Well, if you just mean if they're available at all, well, then that would be almost every package. For example, I want to build the latest version of UNIFI4. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Unifi 4?
Unifi 4?
It's going to build all of the dependencies. But Bash, for example, is available from package already. So why does it build that if the build options are the same? Just use the package from package and build it from ports. If it is actually exactly the same version, you can cheat and download the package from package and put it in the directory where Poudre dumps its stuff, and it'll detect it and do an incremental build. However, if the version in the official repo is slightly older, it will want to rebuild it anyway. But yeah, you can download the dependencies into the target directory, and it will detect that they're the same and not rebuild those. That comes in handy more for incremental builds, where after you build, you change one option, you build again, it only changes the things that actually need to change. In general, I don't think Bash takes very long to build, so I wouldn't be that worried about it. But
Oh, you don't know what hardware is on too, though.
Well, I think Bash builds fairly quickly on all hardware. It's like I built FFmpeg on a Pi.
486.
I built FFmpeg from source on a Pi the other day because there wasn't a package of it because some math dependency package had a error in the patching process. Somehow, the patch it needs to apply requires GNU patch, not BSD patch. I didn't even know our ports tree supported that. But GNU patch crashed with an error about a bad address or something. And so that package didn't compile, and so there was no FFmpeg package for my Pi when I needed it, so I had to build it from source. That takes a while, but it actually didn't take as long as I was fearing.
It's doable.
But yeah, so in order to hack that with Poudre, if in the, it's like user local Poudre data packages repo name or whatever, if you drop the package files from the package repo in there, it'll do it. I don't think there's an automated way to do it, mostly because you can really not depend on the other repo having exactly the same things. Although that's one thing I would love to see is actually the official repos, including the snapshot of the ports tree from when they were done, or even just in the metadata have the revision so you could check it out. And so you could teach Poudre to say, hey, I need to build stuff that is exactly identical to the ports tree that this set of packages were built for. That could be very handy, especially since they do a snapshot of, or a tag in SVN of the ports tree for each of the releases. So like there's what the ports tree looked like exactly the day of FreeBSD 10.3 and so on. So it's possible that could be added in the future, but doesn't exist now that I know of. But there's a little hack, and maybe it'll help.
Your little hack to drop files in might work well enough for what you need.
Okay, so next up, Pete asks a whole bunch of questions.
Yeah, I didn't know what to put for the title of this one.
So he says Pete has been a Windows/DOS user for 24 years, and before the most recent Windows release. Once the myriad of privacy issues came to light, I began looking for a different desktop OS. Ever since I saw my colleague and roommate using Linux 20 years ago, I've been curious about Linux, as well as the other Unixes, and I just didn't have a good excuse to explore it until now. My interest also coincided with the discovery of your podcast about 2 months ago. One of the first podcasts I saw recommended by Reddit was the Linux Action Show, and then eventually got into TechSnap and then BSD Now. I thought that BSD was some fairly niche OS that didn't have much market share. So I imagine my surprise after listening to the show for a few weeks and discovering how widespread BSD actually is. Not only does BSD have more going for it than I imagined, but apparently I've been using BSD for the past several years in his important network appliances like his FreeNAS and his pfSense. Apparently I was really good at completing the missing title FreeBSD tags near the version line. After a few shows, I couldn't resist. I had to fire up FreeBSD and see what it could do. So I spun up a VM on his Proxmox machine and installed MB, which is the open source version of Plex. So far, he's been immensely impressed with FreeBSD and is interested in replacing more of his home network infrastructure. So, on to the questions. One, FreeBSD seems to default to, for what it means at least, is very unfamiliar shell, TCSH. DigitalOcean has a nice tutorial on replacing it with Bash, but if I'm going to get into FreeBSD, I feel like I should probably learn to use the tools that is the default since it's chosen for a reason. But is TCSH better than Bash, or is it simply more powerful or useful or powerful in FreeBSD? And do you know of any good guides or cheat sheets for using TCSH, especially as someone who is marginally more familiar with Bash? If you're more familiar with Bash, you might just try the default bin sh, which since 9.0, I think, has had the arrow keys working and stuff like that, which makes it relatively usable as a default shell.
Bash-like.
Yeah. Because TCSH is basically a C shell, so instead of all of its scripting abilities looking like shell script, it actually looks a little bit more like C. So the way you do, for loops is a little different and so on. I don't use it for that, really.
No.
I have a .tcshrc file that does typo correction. So if I type, psaux pipe grep something, and my finger lingered on the shift key a little too long, and grep is spelled with a capital G, it'll be like, sorry, that doesn't exist. Did you actually mean grep with a lowercase g? And I just press Y, and it corrects it, and, that's very nice. But I learned all those tricks, actually, from Drew Levine's old book, BSD Hacks, which has lots of great tips for that kind of a thing. But yeah, if you're familiar with Bash, you can just install Bash or just use sh, which is much closer to Bash. The for loops and everything are the same. The big thing that always got me with TCSH is the way you redirect output is different than in regular sh or Bash. So if you use just regular sh, it'll be much more familiar to you and is still included in the base system. But, at Scale Engine, we install Bash for our users by default because it results in less confusion. Next question. He says, once I get more familiar with FreeBSD, I'm also interested in replacing Proxmox with maybe Beehive. My use case for a hypervisor is fairly limited. Basically, just need the ability to run a few Linux or FreeBSD VMs, as well as a single Windows VM with USB pass-through for a local printer. Would Beehive be okay for this? Up until recently, it worked great for Linux's, not so well for Windows, but with the latest patch that we just talked about last week, it now can run Windows perfectly fine. It has hardware pass-through. It doesn't have USB pass-through per se, but you can pass through the entire USB controller. But that's not one device, then you would actually be giving up that whole group of USB ports, which I think is just 2 or 4 ports at a time. So you might actually be able to get away with it by just giving away, one little group of ports. But I've never tried that, so I can't guarantee it'll work, but I'm pretty sure.
Heck, you can buy a USB card, PCI card dirt cheap, pass through that whole device.
Yeah, and then just pass that whole device, PCI device through into the VM and do it that way. So you can probably get it to work, yes. The USB pass-through is the only kind of iffy thing there. He says, also, does Beehive/FreeBSD have capabilities with the Intel i350 network card, which allows PCI pass-through for individual ports? That's IOSRV. I don't know if it supports it on the i350. I didn't know that the i350 had that. I'm not sure. I know on the 10 gigabit cards it does support it.
Sure.
So I imagine the same thing applies to the i350. He says, I found these cards exceptionally difficult to get working in Proxmox, which rather defeated the purpose of getting them. Yeah. The i350 is just gigabit, right? And so you don't actually need the offload isn't going to help you as much, but it should work. Number 3, I've been looking at spinning up a DigitalOcean droplet and using it as a static IP for his home network. My plan was to run Nginx or Apache and then VPN back to his home network and use a reverse proxy so that I could be able to visit something like plex.mydomain.com or owncloud.mydomain.com via the external address, and then his house would VPN into there and it would deal with it. I realize using dynamic DNS is maybe an easier solution, but I'm already planning on having the VPS spun up anyway, so that could work. That should work pretty well. He said, I tried making this work on Linux, but I realized 2 things very quickly. 1, I hate IP tables. Yes, I think everybody does.
A lot of people.
And 2, my networking and routing skills are exceedingly rusty. Do you have any good guides for learning how to route traffic in the above plan on FreeBSD? If you set it up right, you wouldn't need to do anything fancy. You have the VPN on an internal set of IPs or whatever with a subnet. As long as you put OpenVPN in bridged mode, that should just work. And then you have the Nginx, and it would just proxy to that IP address over the VPN, and it should just work magically. You shouldn't actually need to do any routing per se. Now, if you're going to forward ports, it gets a little trickier, but again, it should just be exactly the same as you would do if it was on the same network. Basically, the OpenVPN connection is just a virtual, it looks like it's your second NIC on your machine that goes to your LAN. So it should just work without you having to do any actual routing. And then finally, he says, FreeBSD really inspired me a great deal. I'm down with donors to the FreeBSD Foundation and interested in trying to contribute in some other ways. What programming languages would you suggest learning if someone was interested in contributing some code to the FreeBSD project? Well, there's a bit of everything. There's lots of shell script. Mostly it's written in C. But if you just want to do documentation, you can just do that in plain text. And if you really want to get into it, there's the man format is interesting. And there's a DocBook, which is basically XML with a special set of things for designing documentation and books. But it's very easy to learn.
I'd say the ports tree, though, if you're already kind of a novice programmer, you are really probably well fitted to port stuff over and maintain ports.
In particular, ports has stuff written in every language. So if you're already a Python person, you can just work on the Python ports. There's lots of them and they need help. If you're a Ruby programmer, there's lots of Ruby ports and they need help. And same for Java, C++, basically every language, even Go. There's lots of ports and the ports people need the help. And so you can just work with the programming languages you already know and not have to learn a new one. Because, the one where you're an expert, you're probably more valuable there than learning a new one. But you're welcome to learn a new one. And it's, especially C, there's lots of great C code in FreeBSD to read over and learn it. And he says, thanks again for the podcast. I really enjoy the in-depth explanation of all the various patches and new programs and everything that comes out every week. Even though I don't really understand everything that you guys talk about, I love that getting all that information. So many other podcasts seem more interesting in philosophical debates than actually digging into problems or interesting applications.
Sure. Oh, cool. We're glad you're enjoying the show. All right, so last up this week, we have Van, who writes in saying, I'm paying for some hosting services that I should probably just be serving out of my basement. In other words, mail. He said, however, giving terms of service to my ISP, I was SOL as they're blocking some of the necessary ports, like 25 for starters.
Yeah, and mail really, you're on, home ISPs are on every blacklist for mail because of infected Windows machines. So yeah, mail's not a fun thing to run at home.
And he said, wouldn't it be nice to have a bridgehead server somewhere out there in the real internet that I could establish a necessary secure tunnel to relay in and out of for various traffic?
Turns out we just talked about that.
I know, right? Funny enough. He said, my general OS preference for providing network services in descending order of preference is OpenBSD, which is currently running on all my firewalls, FreeBSD, OS X, a sharp stick in the eye, some manner of Linux, give up, it can't be done, and finally Windows, which is a good list. But he says, BSD VM appears to have gone away, and they offered native OpenBSD support. So I figured, what the heck, let me try a FreeBSD VM at DigitalOcean since they offer native support. And he said, where did I hear about those folks? I wonder. He said, after some trials and tribulations and setting up pfSense on a home VM to act as an offline CA, he said, easy RSA was not playing nice. He said, I got my tunnels up. but I was having a devil of a time getting inbound traffic through a double NAT down to the local mail server. He said, in a moment of desperation, I Googled OpenBSD DigitalOcean and followed the first link I found, which he has the link here. He said it was a bit dated, but it worked and was really simple. I deviated from the instructions in that I was installing 5.8. He said, yeah, I haven't upgraded my other firewalls yet, and I chose auto disk layout. He said it worked like a charm. The only glitch I encountered was that DHCP didn't work, and you were using mini root, so your network interface needs to work in order to get through the various packages necessary to complete the install. But he said, life is good. I'm using a single NAT plus RelayD. Everything's going according to plan, and I didn't even get close to having to sharpen a stick. So keep up the great show, Van.
Yeah, I wonder why you had to have double NAT.
I don't know. That's interesting.
Yeah, with
curious to see what his config
whatever you
was.
could do on OpenBSD, you should be able to do on FreeBSD, and there's a port of RelayD to FreeBSD, so you can even use that, or Nginx or whatever. And yeah, I guess RelayD is better. Nginx does have support for mail, but I've never used it.
It's cool that he got that all figured out, though. So congrats, and keep watching the show. We're glad we can encourage you to do cool stuff like this. Okay, so we're wrapping up the show this week, folks. So, of course, send your comments if you have any questions, any show ideas, or if you see stories that are like, ooh, they should mention this on BSD Now. You need to send that to feedback@bsdnow.tv. That's the only address we really monitor, so please try and send everything there. If you send it to a personal address for me and Allan, or Twitter, or YouTube comments, God forbid, it probably won't get seen. So try and send it to feedback@bsdnow.tv. We'll make sure it gets thrown in the hopper, and we can hopefully talk about it on a future show, which will be excellent. So, of course, we'll be back next week with another episode, and look forward to talking to you soon about how our trip to Canada went. So stay tuned, and we'll be talking to you again here soon.
See you next week.